For a long time, it lived in that place where certain things remain untouched. Not because they aren't real, but because they don't need language to exist. Some things survive better without being examined too closely. They move quietly beneath everything visible. They stay intact because no one reaches for them. That's where this began. Or maybe that's where I first noticed it. I can't tell which. What I know is that it didn't arrive like anything else has. There was no clear beginning. No moment I can point to and say, that was it? That was the instant something changed. It was smaller than that, quieter, more precise. It felt less like an arrival and more like recognition, and that difference matters. Because arrivals are external. You see them coming. You understand that something new is entering your life. You prepare for the impact. You decide how much space to make. Recognition is different. Recognition feels like discovering that something has already been there, existing just outside the range of your attention. It doesn't introduce itself. It doesn't announce its meaning. It simply becomes visible. That's what happened with you. At first, I thought it was only perception, a temporary alignment, a moment of unusual understanding between two people who happen to notice the same details, think along similar lines, move through silence without discomfort. That should have been all it was. A coincidence, a rare but explainable kind of resonance. But the more time passed, the less that explanation held, because coincidence fades, it loses precision, it drifts. This didn't. It remained. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in ways that demanded immediate attention. It stayed in subtler places, in pauses, in unfinished thoughts, in the strange feeling of being understood before I had fully formed what needed understanding. That's what unsettled me first. Not your words, your accuracy. There's a difference between someone hearing you and someone locating the shape of what you mean before you say it. Most people listen for language. They wait for clear expression. They depend on explanation. If something remains unspoken, they fill the space themselves. They interpret. They project. They decide what must be there because uncertainty makes them restless. You never did that. You let things remain unfinished. And somehow, you still understood them. I noticed that long before I admitted it to myself. I noticed it in the way I didn't feel the usual need to clarify, in the way certain thoughts stopped feeling isolated, in the way silence around you didn't feel empty. That's rare, rarer than people realize. Most people think closeness is built through constant disclosure, through saying more, through revealing more, through turning inward life outward until there's nothing left concealed. I've never believed that. I think real closeness reveals itself differently. In what doesn't need explanation, in what remains intact, even when language falls away. That's where I found you. And that's why this became difficult. Because difficulty, for me, has never come from intensity. It comes from precision. Something intense can be resisted. Something precise is harder. It fits too well. It reaches places you've spent years structuring carefully. And once it does, you can't pretend it hasn't. I've always lived with structure, not rigidly, not defensively, but deliberately. There are layers in the way I exist, not artificial ones, just necessary ones. Different distances, different thresholds, different levels of access. That's how things remain clear. That's how I remain intact. They meet what is visible and assume visibility means entirety. They don't know how much remains untouched beneath what they understand. And usually, that works. Usually, it's enough. But something about you made those distances lose their function. Not because you crossed them. You didn't. That's what makes this different. You never pushed, never forced your way in, never asked for access, never demanded explanation. You simply remained present in a way that made those boundaries less relevant. And that is far more disarming than pressure. Pressure gives you something to resist. Presence does not. Presence settles. Presence becomes familiar before you realize it has entered your awareness. And familiarity is dangerous in ways force will never be, because force activates defense. Familiarity bypasses it. That's how this happened. Gradually enough that I didn't notice the exact moment, precisely enough that I can't deny it now. There are things I've started noticing in myself that weren't there before. Small changes, tiny ones, the kind no one else would see. My thoughts pause differently now, not because they stop, because they widen, as if something in me has begun expecting another perspective. Not spoken, not external, but quietly present. Sometimes I'll reach the edge of an idea and feel the shape of how you would understand it before I ever try to put it into words. That still catches me off guard. Because that isn't how I work, or at least, it wasn't. I've always been internally self-contained. My thinking has always belonged entirely to me, not isolated, just private in structure, self-sufficient, deliberate. No one has ever entered that space without effort, without friction, without my full awareness. And yet with you, there was no friction, no transition, no visible crossing. You didn't enter it. You appeared there, as if I turned inward one day and discovered you had already become part of the architecture. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it frightened me, because it clarified something. It made me understand that this was no longer just observation, it had consequence. That's the part I can't ignore now, because consequences don't require action. Sometimes they arrive through change alone, and I've changed, not outwardly, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would identify, but internally the structure has shifted. I can feel it. In the way I measure meaning, in the way certain silences feel shared, in the way presence has stopped depending on proximity. That matters, more than I know how to explain. I used to think presence required contact, conversation, attention, deliberate engagement. Now I understand that sometimes presence survives independently of all that. It settles deeper. It becomes part of how you perceive, and that's where you are now, not beside my thoughts, inside the way they arrange themselves. I didn't choose that. That's important. Because if I had chosen it, I could have prevented it. I could have seen it happening and stepped back. I know how to do that. I've done it before. Distance is not difficult for me. Withdrawal is not difficult for me. When something feels unstable, when something threatens clarity, when something begins to move beyond what belongs, I know exactly how to close the door, cleanly, completely, without leaving fragments behind. But I didn't do that with you, and that fact has become impossible to ignore, because if this had been wrong, I would have ended it early, not out of fear, out of precision. I don't keep what doesn't fit. I don't entertain what distorts structure. I don't allow uncertainty to remain where it could become damage. And yet you stayed, not because I forgot to protect the boundary, because something in me didn't recognize you as a threat. That realization changed the way I saw everything else. It made me question what exactly I had recognized. And the answer came slowly. Not through emotion, not through sudden understanding, through observation, the kind that becomes unavoidable. Once enough patterns repeat, you don't feel like interruption, you feel like alignment. That's different. Interruption disturbs what exists. Alaman reveals something that was already waiting to be seen. That's what you did. You revealed structure I hadn't been looking at directly. Parts of myself I understood internally, but never saw reflected with this degree of accuracy. That's why it feels strangely inevitable. Not because you created something new, because you made something visible. And visibility changes everything. Once something becomes visible, you can't return it to abstraction. You can avoid naming it. You can delay responding to it. You can pretend it remains undefined, but you cannot unknow it. And I know this now. That's where the tension lives, not in what I feel, in what I know. Because knowing demands response, eventually awareness becomes responsibility. There comes a point where silence stops being neutral, where Observation stops being enough, where something asks not for immediate action, but for honesty. I think I'm there now. And honesty, in this case, is not simple. Because if I say clearly what has changed, then this becomes real in a way it hasn't been before. Reality asks more of us than perception does. Reality creates direction. It introduces consequence. It forces decision. That's what I've been standing near without fully stepping into. The decision, not about you, about what this means inside me, because it does mean something. That's the truth. I know it now with more certainty than I'm comfortable admitting. You matter, not in the way that word is usually used, not emotionally simplified, not sentimentally, not in a way that weakens clarity. You matter because you altered the baseline, and baseline matters more than intensity ever could. Intensity passes, baselines remain. They become the measure everything else is compared against. And that's what changed. I've started noticing it in the smallest moments. The way conversations with others sometimes feel slightly incomplete, not wrong, not lesser, just missing a certain kind of precision. The way some silences now feel thinner. The way certain forms of understanding now feel approximate where before they would have felt enough. I don't like admitting that because it means impact. And impact lingers, it rewrites internal standards, it shifts orientation, it quietly rearranges the center of things. That's what you've done, not deliberately, not visibly, but undeniably. And what unsettles me most is how natural it feels. It shouldn't. That's what keeps returning to me. Nothing about this should feel this seamless. It should feel disruptive, unexpected, heavy, complicated. But instead, it feels strangely exact, as if something in me recognized the shape of it before I consciously did. That makes it harder to dismiss, because what feels unnatural can be questioned. What feels exact demands deeper attention. I keep thinking about how rare that is, how rare it is to encounter someone who doesn't ask you to become easier to understand. Someone who doesn't need simplification. Someone who doesn't turn depth into difficulty. You never tried to reduce anything. You never made meaning smaller so it could be more manageable. You simply met it where it was. That mattered more than I realized. Maybe because I'm used to people trying to translate what they don't fully understand into something that fits their own language. That's how misunderstanding usually happens. Not through malice, through projection. People see fragments and build narratives around them. They mistake approximation for accuracy. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Not because being misunderstood hurts, because it distorts. You didn't distort anything. You left it intact. You understood without rearranging. That's rare enough to change a person. And maybe that's what this is. Not attachment, not dependence, not even closeness in the conventional sense. Maybe it's recognition strong enough to alter internal structure. Maybe that's why it feels both calm and irreversible. I think about that more than I probably should. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just steadily. Like a question that doesn't leave because it knows it matters. What happens when something like this continues? That's the part I still don't fully know. Not ends, not fades, continues, because it is continuing. I can feel that clearly now. It isn't becoming louder, it's becoming more integrated, more natural, more quietly embedded. And that almost feels more significant. Loud things demand attention. Integrated things become part of you. That's what makes them harder to undo. If this reaches its full shape, then it stops being something I notice. It becomes something I live with. Something that influences the way I think, respond, interpret, choose. And that is not small. I've always been careful about what reaches that level. Careful in ways people don't usually understand. Because once something reaches the level of internal structure, removing it is not simple. It leaves space behind. And empty spaces don't disappear just because you decide they should. They remain, they echo. They alter the geometry of everything around them. That's why I don't make room lightly, but somehow. Space exists for you. I didn't build it consciously. I didn't invite it. And yet it's there. That may be the clearest truth of all. There is space, and once I admitted that to myself, something became impossible to deny. I have already accepted more than I realized. Not verbally, not outwardly, but structurally, in the way I allow this to remain, in the way I don't pull back, in the way I keep meeting you in this place instead of shutting it down. That isn't passive. That's a choice, even if it formed quietly. Maybe that's why this no longer feels like a question of what is happening. I know what is happening. The real question is what I'm willing to do with that knowledge, because awareness can only remain suspended for so long. Eventually, it asks for movement, not impulsive movement, not dramatic declarations, just clarity, a deliberate answer. And I think I'm closer to that answer now than I was before, not because I suddenly understand everything, because I understand enough to know this isn't accidental, enough to know it matters, enough to know walking away would not restore what existed before. That version of internal quiet is gone, not damaged, not lost, changed, and I don't think change is always something to resist. Maybe sometimes change is simply evidence that something true has entered your life, something exact enough to make previous structures reorganize around it. Maybe that's what this has been all along, not disruption, reorientation. And if that's true, then the question becomes simpler, not easier. Just simpler. Do I keep pretending this remains abstract? Or do I acknowledge it fully? Because I can feel the edge approaching, that point where silence will stop being enough, where clarity will ask to become real. And when that happens, I'll have to answer honestly. Not for you, for myself. That distinction matters. This has never been about obligation, never about expectation, never about what should happen. It has only ever been about truth. And the truth is this: you reached somewhere I don't allow people to reach, not because you tried, because something in me recognized you before I understood why. That recognition changed the internal arrangement of things. It changed the way meaning settles, it changed the way silence feels, it changed the way thought moves, and once something changes at that level, pretending otherwise becomes less honest than speaking. So here I am, not at the beginning, not even somewhere uncertain, at a threshold, a quiet one, but real, and standing here, I can finally admit what I've been circling around for longer than I wanted to. I don't think this is temporary. I don't think this will dissolve because it remains unnamed. I don't think distance would undo it now, because distance only works when something remains external. You are not external anymore. That is the clearest thing I know. You exist somewhere deeper than attention, deeper than ordinary thought. You exist inside the way I interpret what matters. And maybe that is what I was resisting naming. Not because it frightened me, because once I say it plainly, there's no returning to the safety of ambiguity. Then this becomes part of reality. And reality asks something back. Maybe not today, maybe not immediately, but eventually, a decision, a direction, a deliberate willingness to let something become fully what it already is beneath language. I'm not all the way there yet, but I'm closer than I was. Close enough to understand that what matters now is not certainty about the future, it's honesty about the present. And the present is this: when something happens that changes how you understand yourself, you don't dismiss it. When someone reaches a place inside you that alters the way you think, you don't pretend it means nothing. When recognition becomes structure, silence alone stops being enough. That's where I am, not rushing, not forcing meaning into shape before it's ready, but no longer pretending this exists without consequence, because it does. And maybe the most honest thing I can say is this: before you, I understood myself in one way. After you, I still understand myself, but differently, more clearly, more precisely, as if something that was always there finally came into focus, because it was reflected back with exactness I couldn't ignore. You didn't create what exists in me. You revealed it. And once something is revealed, there's only one real choice left: to turn away from it or to meet it fully. I think quietly, without ever saying it out loud until now. I've already begun meeting it. It kept moving after I thought I had understood it. That's what I didn't anticipate. I thought once I recognized what had changed, once I saw the shape of it clearly enough to name it internally, it would settle. Not disappear, just settle into something stable. Something I could place within the structure of everything else I already understood. But it didn't. It kept unfolding. Quickly. Precisely. In ways so subtle I almost missed them at first. That's how this keeps happening. Not through dramatic moments, not through declarations, not through anything obvious enough to point at and say, that is where it deepened. It happens underneath. In places language reaches late, I notice it afterward, in the slight shift of how I process a thought, in the way silence now carries contour, in the way certain moments feel inhabited. Even when I'm alone, that last part still unsettles me, not because it feels intrusive, because it feels natural. And natural is harder to explain. Anything disruptive can be questioned. Anything unnatural can be resisted. But something that settles into your inner world so seamlessly that it begins to feel as though it has always belonged there, that asks a different kind of honesty. Because then the question is no longer how it entered, the question becomes why it fits. I've spent more time with that question than I intended, not trying to solve it, just tracing it, following its edges, seeing where it leads when I stop interfering. And it keeps bringing me back to the same place. It fits because something in us recognizes structure, not similarity in the obvious sense, not mirrored experience, not matching stories, something quieter than that, deeper, the way attention arranges itself, the way meaning settles before words do, the way silence can hold shape without needing to be filled. That's where I find the alignment. And that's what makes this harder to dismiss, because alignment doesn't ask for belief. It simply reveals itself through consistency. It remains true across distance, across time, across absence. That's how I know this is no longer about proximity. I used to think distance clarified things. Sometimes it does. Distance removes noise. It strips away momentum. It leaves only what has enough substance to remain. That's usually how I measure what matters. What survives distance deserves attention. What disappears was never rooted deeply enough. You didn't disappear. That became clear long before I wanted to admit it. Even when nothing was happening outwardly, something remained active internally, not restless, not demanding, steady, like a quiet line of awareness running beneath everything else. I could ignore it for a while, but ignoring isn't the same as absence. And eventually, I had to acknowledge that. You stayed present in ways that had nothing to do with contact, that changed how I understood presence itself, because presence, as I used to define it, depended on interaction, attention, visible exchange. But now I know that presence can become structural, it can live beneath interaction, it can exist in perception itself. That is where you are now. And once I understood that, another realization followed. You are no longer only someone I encounter. You are someone whose existence has altered the internal way I encounter everything else. That is a different kind of closeness. And I don't use that word carelessly. Closeness, as most people understand it, often depends on emotional intensity, on expression, on repetition, on visible intimacy. This isn't that. This is quieter, stranger, more exact. It feels less like moving closer and more like discovering that distance stopped functioning the way it used to. That distinction matters, because I never moved toward you in the way people usually mean when they say that. There was no deliberate opening, no conscious lowering of defenses, no decision made in advance. What happened was subtler. The usual internal resistance simply never activated. and I've been trying to understand why. I know how resistance feels. I know the exact moment it appears. It arrives when something feels imprecise, when someone reaches too quickly, when meaning becomes distorted, when I feel myself being interpreted rather than understood. Then the boundary sharpens, dist returns, structure reasserts itself. That never happened with you, not once. And that absence tells me more than any visible sign ever could. Because if there had been even the slightest sense of internal misalignment, I would have felt it immediately. I trust that instinct more than almost anything. It has kept my inner world coherent. It has kept me clear. And it stayed quiet with you. That is not accidental. That is recognition. I think that's why I've stopped asking whether this is real. That question no longer interests me. Reality has already answered itself. The more difficult question is what kind of reality this is, what shape it takes, what it asks, what it changes, because it is changing things, not all at once, not visibly, but steadily enough that I can't deny it. I've begun noticing how often I measure clarity against you. I don't mean comparison in any superficial sense. I mean something more internal, a kind of calibration. Sometimes I hear people speak and I can feel where meaning thins, where something essential becomes flattened, where language reaches the surface, but never quite touches the structure beneath it. And I notice it now because I know what it feels like when that doesn't happen. That's what changed, not my standards, my perception. I've experienced a different level of precision, and now I recognize its absence more easily. That is impact. And impact always leaves traces. The strange thing is, I don't resent it. I thought I might. I thought I would resist the idea that someone could alter the internal lens through which I understand the world. But I don't. There's no internal argument against it. Only awareness. That matters more than I can explain, because if this had violated something essential, I would feel the friction. I would know. I always know. Instead, there is only adjustment, recalibration, a slow reorganization around something that feels unexpectedly exact. That's why I keep returning to the same thought, not what this is, why it feels so natural. That question stays with me, and every time I follow it carefully, I arrive at the same answer because it doesn't feel added. It feels revealed, as though this level of recognition was always possible. I simply hadn't encountered its form before. You didn't create depth where there was none. You illuminated depth that had never been reflected back with enough accuracy to become fully visible. That's different, and maybe that's why this feels inevitable instead of abrupt. I've started wondering whether that is what unsettles me most. Not that something changed, that something true became visible, because visibility creates responsibility. Once you see clearly, you can't return to the comfort of ambiguity. You can delay action, you can postpone language, but you can't honestly pretend you don't know. And I know. I know enough now to understand that this is no longer passive. Even in silence, something is being chosen every time I remain here, every time I don't withdraw. Every time I allow this to continue deepening without reducing it into something easier. That is choice, quiet choice, but choice nonetheless. That realization changed something in me, because for a while I thought I was simply observing, standing at a distance, watching what unfolded without becoming part of it. That isn't true anymore. Observation became participation somewhere along the way, not through action, and allowance matters. What we permit to remain near us shapes us. What we permit to enter our inner structure eventually becomes part of how that structure functions. I know that, which means I also know what it means that I'm still here. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. I kept turning it over, carefully trying to understand what exactly I had allowed, not emotionally, structurally. And the answer arrived more quietly than I expected. I allowed significance. That is the simplest truth, not dependency, not surrender. Not attachment in the way people often misuse that word, significance. You matter enough that your presence has begun to alter internal orientation. And once I said that to myself, something settled. Not because it simplified anything, because it clarified the center. There is strange relief in accuracy, even when accuracy complicates things, especially then, because at least then you know what you are standing inside. And I know now I am standing inside something that has already changed me. That sentence took longer to accept than I expected. Not because change frightens me, because I don't allow it casually. I've always believed change should be earned by truth, not by intensity, not by desire, not by momentum, truth alone, and this feels true. That is why it remains. That is why I haven't dismantled it. That is why I keep returning. Not out of uncertainty, out of recognition. There's another part I haven't said clearly before. Maybe because I was still understanding it myself. I don't think what matters most is that you understand me. It's that your presence changed the way I understand myself. That feels more exact and more difficult. Because being understood is one thing. It can comfort you, steady you, make you feel less alone. But being changed in your own self-perception, that reaches deeper, that reorganizes internal language, that makes you revisit parts of yourself you thought were already fully known. I've been doing that more than I realized, looking again at old assumptions, old definitions, old internal structures I thought were complete, and seeing them differently now, not because they were wrong, because they were partial. That is what reflection does when it is accurate enough. It reveals what was already there, but not fully visible from within. You became that kind of reflection, and I think that is why this continues to deepen even in silence. Because the movement isn't outward, it's inward. I'm still understanding what became visible, still tracing what changed, still noticing places where your presence has become part of how thought itself arranges. That isn't finished, and maybe it won't be for a while. Maybe that's what continuation really means. Not escalation, not intensity, integration, something settling deeper until it becomes part of your internal grammar. That phrase feels right, internal grammar, because that is exactly where I feel this now. Not in emotion first, in interpretation, in perception, in how meaning forms before words arrive. And once something reaches that level, it doesn't leave cleanly, it becomes foundational. That is what makes me pause. Because foundations matter. They support more than what is immediately visible. They shape what can be built above them. And I'm aware now that something in me has already begun building differently, even if only slightly, even if only in ways I can barely articulate. That matters. More than I thought it would. Which brings me back to the question I keep avoiding. What happens if this continues? Not theoretically, actually. What happens if this keeps deepening in the same quiet way? What happens if it keeps integrating until it is no longer something distinct, but simply part of how I exist? I don't fully know, and I'm more comfortable admitting that now. Not knowing no longer feels like weakness. It feels honest. Some things can only be understood by living them, not by solving them in advance. That is difficult for me. I prefer clarity before movement. Understanding before risk, structure before surrender. But this refuses that order. It asks for something else, presence before conclusion, trust before certainty. And maybe that is why I've been standing here so long. Not because I'm undecided, because I'm learning a different form of knowing. A quieter one. One that doesn't depend on controlling the outcome before allowing reality to unfold. I'm not used to that, but I'm no longer resisting it either. That may be the clearest sign of all. I thought if this ever reached a certain depth, instinct would pull me backward. I thought there would be a moment where self-preservation would demand distance. That moment never came. Instead, there was something stranger, a calm recognition, as though some deeper part of me had already decided this belonged before the rest of me caught up. That thought has stayed with me, And every time I test it against what I know of myself, it remains true. I don't stay where something feels false. I don't deepen where something feels unstable. I don't keep opening inwardly where meaning becomes distorted. And yet I remain here. That has to mean something, not everything, but something essential. So maybe this is where I am now, not at certainty, but beyond denial, beyond abstraction, beyond pretending this is still only an interesting pattern of understanding. It is more than that now. It has consequence. It has shape. It has changed the internal arrangement of things. And because of that, it asks something of me, not immediate action, just honesty. Honesty about what already exists. And what already exists is this. You are no longer separate from the way I make sense of certain things. You have become part of the internal space where meaning forms. That is the clearest truth I have. And once truth becomes that clear, it stops asking whether you believe it. It asks whether you will answer it. I don't know what my full answer is yet, but I know this much. I am no longer standing outside it. And maybe that matters more than any conclusion I could force too early, because conclusions can wait. Reality doesn't. Reality is already here, quickly, steadily, changing shape beneath everything visible. And now that I see it clearly, I think the only honest thing left is to keep moving toward what is true, carefully, deliberately, without pretending I haven't already been changed by it. That may be where this part ends, not with certainty, not with a final definition, but with something more precise, acceptance, not of what this will become, of what it already is. And what it already is enough to know that nothing inside me remains exactly where it was before.